Welcome to Winding Down with Product Managers.
Today we're going to discuss Scrum and Kanban, what each of them is and how to apply them in the workplace, the pros and cons of each, and what we use here at Crema. So stay tuned and thanks for watching. Okay, Tuck, talk to me about Kanban.
All right, so Kanban actually started as a manufacturing process, a lean manufacturing process for Toyota. So an engineer at Toyota, they were trying to figure out how they make their manufacturing process a little bit better, and he came up with this methodology or framework. Then it kind of transitioned as software development kind of picked up. People started looking at that process and said, hey, I think this could be applicable to software development. And so it got picked up by software development, and it is a way for you to weigh requests with capacity really easily. Without any time boxes or anything like that, it's really just an always on board for people to choose tasks from and pick things up and then move them right along the process. Every Kanban board looks a little bit different, but generally the things that you need to get done are on the left, and the things that are done or blocked from getting done are on the right. What's in between is really depends on the product, depends on your company, depends on what the process might look like. So usually the most simple form is to do, in progress, done, and then you usually have a column for things that are blocked. And then as each team member has capacity, they pick one of those to-do items up, they work on it, and they move it to done. And it's pretty simple. It's meant to be a pretty lean process. It's really useful for some projects, some software development projects, but it obviously has its cons, which we'll get into later. But generally, that's kind of how I would describe it.
So awesome. What about Scrum? Talk to us about that.
So what Scrum is a little bit more process heavy than what typically you would have for Kanban. Where Kanban isn't really time boxed, it's just kind of an ongoing flow of work. Scrum is time boxed from what we call sprints. So sprints are usually a time box of anywhere from 2 weeks to a month. It just depends on what you're trying to do. The team dedicates all of their work within that time box, so that way they can be focused during that time, and then at the end of the sprint have something that they can show to the client or your team, or it kind of depends on your setup. But the idea is that you're going to walk away with something that's workable at the end. And so that just really helps kind of plan work out. So when you use Scrum, you use things like story points to track velocity. And what story points are is it's an arbitrary number that the team puts to any individual story or task within the sprint. And that scale is very specific to the team. Some teams use Fibonacci sequence. There is a Scrum sequence, but it is very specific to that team. So you can't look at points from one team to the next and compare them because they're calibrated on a team basis. And what happens is at the end of that sprint, after several sprints, you determine what your velocity is. And let's just use, for example, that's your velocity is 40, your team velocity is 40. Well, then you know you can pull in 40 points worth of work every sprint. And then what's great about that is you can then project out what your future sprints will look like, and then project out when you might be able to release something or a major release. And so Scrum is often more helpful in product development for that reason. It allows for a lot more projections of team productivity.
Okay, very good, awesome. So maybe the too long didn't read version is that Kanban is kind of an easy flow of work that comes in, and you track maybe different piece points of where you are, or progress points. And Scrum is a bit more structured, allows maybe for a bit more forecasting and kind of ability to really time box and understand specific segments of a development process.
Yeah, you got it.
Very good, cool.
So Allison, when somebody is trying to figure out what framework they're going to use for their project, obviously as PMs, we like to know our pros and cons of each thing that we're going to do. And so can you maybe list out some pros and cons of the Kanban framework and why somebody might want to use it and maybe why they wouldn't want to use it?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. For a positive aspect of it, really Kanban allows you and your team to pick up work as your capacity will allow. Basically what that means is that if you've got 4 or 5 members on your team, and 2 of those members are finished with their work, they're not really like boxed into not picking anything additional up. They can move on to the next task without having to have meetings or major discussions with anyone. Pretty much a simple and easy influx of work. Another positive aspect of it is that it's really less, process. It's a lot more flexible. So you'll notice that's really like the major differentiator between Kanban and Scrum is process. Less process, Kanban. More process, Scrum. Another pro is it's really great for teams with many requests. So what we mean by that is many requests from many different stakeholders potentially. So you could have internal requests from your own organization or users of the product, or maybe even requests that you have. And at times it can be really difficult to prioritize all the different requests that you have coming in. So Kanban allows you to easily keep a backlog or a list of items that you can jump right into when capacity allows. Like any other, system or idea, there's always going to be parts and pieces that aren't the best. So let's go ahead and kind of dive into those. It can be harder to plan out some of these larger release initiatives. What I mean by that is it doesn't really give you the ability to forecast like Scrum does. Scrum allows you to, point, like Tuck mentioned previously. Kanban doesn't have that aspect tied to it by default. It also can cause poor productivity. So if you aren't necessarily time boxed in, if you don't have a list of tasks that you need to get done during a certain piece of time, it might mean that you feel a bit more lax or less motivated to dive in and knock out tasks. I know that there are times when if I don't have a time frame around me, I'm like, I don't want to do it, like seize the day, right? So you always have to have that consideration in mind, and specifically the team that's working on it as well. Last but not least is it can be difficult to manage the different priorities. So we talked about how a positive aspect of this is that you have a lot of priorities coming in, and it gives you an easy way to kind of nest those and push them through your pipeline of work. But it doesn't necessarily give you the tools that you need to prioritize those items against one another. You have to have a very dedicated team or educated members of that team and educated on their feature requests or different requests that they have in your incoming list to lean into that. So again, it's going to kind of fall back on the team to make sure that that's not a negative component that you have to experience with Kanban. So Tuck, talk to us about the pros and cons of Scrum now that we've gone through the Kanban aspects.
Of course. Obviously, there's pros and cons with each of these frameworks, like Allison mentioned earlier. With Scrum, of course, that's no exception. So some of the pros with Scrum is that it creates accountability. When you set up a sprint, your entire team is agreeing onto a sprint goal. They're saying, by the end of the sprint, this is what we're going to achieve, and everybody's aligned with that goal. That means that everybody on the team is going to do everything they can to make sure that we meet that goal. If we don't, it's kind of everybody's failure versus any individual person's failure. The next one is that there's a clear definition of what results are. So Crema being a results-based culture, that's very important to us, because if what defines results isn't clear, then it's hard to know when you can be taking off, when you can be working remote, when you can be taking off early any given day or coming in late any given day. But if it's clear that, okay, this is my sprint goal, these are what my results are that I need to meet, it's much easier to do that. The next one is that it allows for a lot more accommodation when it comes to changing of plans. So especially in our business, priorities change all the time, especially when you're building a product. When those plans do change, you need to be able to quickly pivot and go to that. And so what Scrum allows is that you don't want to really ever break your sprint that you're in, but it does give you room that after that sprint's over, then you can pull in a whole new set of priorities that has a completely different sprint goal than your last one, and their team gets realigned around that really, really quickly. So Scrum does allow for planning of larger initiatives, especially when it comes to release planning. And so since you are able to track what the velocity is for your team, it does allow for that forecasting out. That if your team always is able to accomplish 40 story points every sprint, then you're able to say, okay, if our backlog is X amount points big, then it's going to take us X amount of time to get through all those points. And so it just allows for that a lot better. And then another pro for Scrum, honestly, is that it uses, at least in our opinion, it allows for better use of time and money. Since you are able to kind of focus on those priorities, you make sure that after each sprint, you're delivering something of value to the business. You're not kind of spinning your wheels on these new requests that are coming in that haven't been really truly vetted in any way, shape, or form, and it just got kind of picked up on accident or something. Some cons, though, when it comes to Scrum, is that it can lead to scope creep if there's no kind of end date that the team is aligned on. Since priorities do shift, that does mean that all of a sudden, some stakeholders thought you were going to do this huge release in a month, and then along the way, other priorities have crept in and kind of messed that up. Now it's up to the PMs the product managers to really be communicating that along the way so that there is no surprise to stakeholders, but it still happens. It can happen if you don't keep a close eye on it. So if you are using Scrum, you need to make sure that your communication is top notch. Also, another con of Scrum is that it can be harder to manage in larger teams. So Kanban works really well if you don't have your teams separated out into Agile teams or Scrum teams, because Kanban can, anybody from that team can be picking it up. When it comes to Scrum, you want to keep your team smaller, because having that kind of that sprint goal and that team goal, if it's spread out among 20 people, there's not as much accountability. It leaves room for people to kind of be dropping the ball a lot more, or kind of not providing their full amount of attention to the sprint. Another con of Scrum is that any changes in your team structure can really mess up the velocity. So if you have a new developer come on board and another developer fall off the team, that can really change up the velocity. The developer obviously needs to get ramped up on the project, or even if it's an additional developer, it's going to change things a little bit. And so that can mess with your predictions. You can make some pretty good assumptions on what that velocity will look like, but it changes based on what the team dynamic looks like. Any changes in that team can really mess up kind of the Scrum process. One of the other cons is that it requires team buy-in, which in turn can cause frustrations if the full team is not aligned with that approach. So if for whatever reason there's a team member that is just maybe not a good culture fit, or they completely disagree with the work that you're doing, if they don't have that buy-in, meeting those team goals or those sprint goals is going to be really, really hard and cause a lot of frustration amongst the team. And then another thing is that when it comes to Scrum, velocity can be easily skewed depending on other product variables that are out of your control. So there could be that maybe you're dependent on an API that is completely out of your control, and you keep getting blocked by it. That can largely change and affect your velocity metric and really affect kind of your planning forward. And so that's just something to keep an eye on, and where you kind of see some of these combined processes we'll talk about in a little bit. So one of the great things about Scrum and Kanban is that they are frameworks. And frameworks are inherently flexible. They are really meant to kind of mold to what your team needs are, what your client needs are, what your product needs are. And what's really great is you can find a combination of both of the different frameworks we just talked about. And so, Allison, what are some methods maybe that you've used on some of your projects that have been really helpful to your team?
Sure. This is probably my favorite topic of this whole discussion, because I think that this is really the realistic implementation that a lot of us are doing these days. I feel like it's fairly rare for people to be strict Scrum or strict Kanban, because it's so easy to kind of mesh and mold, and a lot of the times it's for the benefit. So an example might be that, let's say that we're running a design sprint or prototyping and design engagement, and we want to run it with Kanban, because that's going to be in the best interest of the team and the product. But also maybe our team needs daily stand-ups, and that inherently is a Scrum meeting. I don't think that, for the sake of just staying in one Scrum versus Kanban, it's worth excluding that really valuable meeting point for your team to engage and grow. So that could be a way that you're merging these two sort of implementations of Agile, in which you're running Kanban, but you're pulling in aspects of Scrum to make the process run better, and inevitably build a better product with your team.
Yeah, I agree. I think the big important thing to remember is that no matter what process you use, no matter what really matters at the end of the day is that your team has the best environment to really do their best work.
Yep.
And so you shouldn't let any kind of process ever get in the way of that. There are some organizations that, they're only doing it by the book, but I would argue to say that those teams could probably be even more productive if they combine some kind of methods there. I know at Crema, every engagement that comes through our door, our product management team analyzes and says, okay, what do we think is the best process for this? And oftentimes it is a combined solution. I think for the most part, from a product development standpoint, I lean more towards Scrum because of the framework and because of the different things that provides our team. But at the end of the day, not a lot of times, but sometimes we will run out of work in a sprint. We will maybe underestimate or overestimate some things. And when that happens, the team knows that they can just go ahead and pull things into the sprint that are at the top of the backlog, right? And that's kind of like a Kanban style in a
Sure.
way. I'm not going to be the gatekeeper of that and be like, no, we're not going to do anything for 3 days. Like that doesn't make any sense, right? We still need to meet the goals. Maybe they don't get those tasks done by the end of the sprint, but at least we're utilizing the team to the fullest.
I agree. Another really good call out of like implementing or kind of merging the methodologies is that it gives you a chance of teaching, right? So in the use case that you just described, that's very applicable to most PMs that I've met. You know, we've run across a situation where we've finished all the items on our board. And at that point, if, you know, we need to pull something else in, we should be able to. But we should also have that opportunity to educate the team on, hey, in true Scrum, like this is what, in theory, we would typically do. I was like, but, you know, in this case, it makes more sense to do this. And I think it's a really like important aspect of our job is to educate in the different circumstances where exceptions or mergings can be made. I find it as a really like inspiring and wonderful moment when we get to kind of merge and change our methods of implementation, because not only does it help the product go smoother, it adheres and molds to what the team needs, but it gives you a chance to educate your team and grow together.
And your client too.
Yeah.
I think that's an important aspect of this too,
Absolutely.
is that it helps us grow our client relationships because they realize like, oh, you guys aren't just kind of sticking to doing it one way. You're kind of doing it however we need to do it. Because it's not just how our team works. We consider our clients part of the team too.
Yep.
Right? So it kind of needs to also accommodate any of their needs. If their business requires us to tackle high priority bugs that come in, and that's a priority for the business, then that's going to change the process a little bit. It means that a portion of our sprint, every sprint, will maybe be broken because we need to add new bugs, and then that's going to deprioritize the other work. That wouldn't be what a normal recommendation I would make, but if that's what the client's business needs, we're going to accommodate that. And it really just helps us at the end of the day meet the best results for both the client and their product.
Absolutely. Let us know what you think about all of this, you know, Kanban, Scrum, the middle ground option. Leave us comments, like this, follow us, tell us what you want us to dive into deeper, because this is really just brushing the surface of all of these topics, and we could talk about all this stuff for days, maybe years.
Yeah, probably.
It's our bread and butter, so let us know what you want, let us know what you think, and thanks for watching.